of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. We meet every Monday at this time in this room during the academic year. For a full list of the speakers for the rest of the quarter, you can go to bec.ucla.edu, and all the titles except for one, Katrina, are up there. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'm just going to give you a preview of the next couple of weeks. Also, please sign in on the sheet that's going around. That helps us keep track of who's here for our sponsors and other people. So next week, May 6th, Lee Gettler is coming, and his talk is entitled The Biology of Fatherhood in Context, Evolutionary Origins, Cross-Cultural Perspectives, and Implications for Men's Health. And he's from University of Notre Dame. And the following week, our very own Brian Wood will be talking. And the title of his talk is Hadza Hunter-Gatherer Movement Ecology and the Sexual Division of Labor. And after that, Courtney Meehan will be here, who was supposed to speak in winter quarter and had to reschedule, so we're pleased that she's coming back. And her talk is entitled The Social Worlds of Infants, Moms, and Microbes. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Katie Starkweather, who is currently a postdoc at the University of New Mexico and is going to be talking to us about women's work.
Hi everybody, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to talk today about variation in women's work, why it's important to understand variation in women's work, including some of the trade-offs that women make between economic tasks and childcare. And I'm going to do all of it mostly in the context of the population where I work in rural Bangladesh. So why study women's work? From a global perspective, it's really important to understand how women's work is different and the trade-offs that women make, because as you can see based on this chart here, everybody below the line has, these are different countries, has more women participating in the labor force in 2016 than they did in 1980. And the takeaway message here is that all around the world, women are increasing their participation in the labor force at really astronomical rates. And this has a lot of implications for how much time they're able to spend on childcare, because this type of work often requires that women be away from the home and be away from their kids in ways that maybe what we think of as sort of traditional subsistence labor doesn't or didn't. And so this is really a global issue. There's been a lot of ink spilled in the West about how women balance work and childcare, as we're probably all very well aware. And this is really becoming increasingly important because the demands of childcare are getting more and more difficult, and the cost of having other people care for your children is becoming more and more expensive. The decisions that women make about their subsistence behavior and the economic tasks that they do has really wide-ranging implications for labor markets and global economies. This is a major issue in Japan right now. Local and national policy making on things like paid family leave, government subsidized childcare, et cetera, things that we're all relatively familiar with. But it also has implications for things like female autonomy, child survival, health and well-being, women's survival, health and well-being, and the rest of their households as well. Usually when anthropologists think about women's work, they think about it within the context of the division of labor. Usually this is called the sexual division of labor. So we really want to understand how women are trading off between work and childcare. And the sexual division of labor encompasses these two components that evolutionary anthropologists think are most important for basically keeping kids alive, which is economic tasks, bringing food into the household, and then actual direct care of children. In humans, women are unable, like they are in most mammalian species, to do all of these tasks all on their own. So usually mammalian mothers can provide subsistence for their young, and also care directly for them. They don't need a lot of help with that, but human mothers need a lot of help, and they often get that from fathers, grandparents, siblings, and other members of their community. Who helps and the type of help that they give is often what's different between and within societies. And we think about how this labor is divided often in a complementary way between men and women. So while there is some variation, which I'm going to talk a lot more about, from a cross-cultural perspective, there are also these trends that pop out, especially in foraging societies, but also in non-foraging societies and all different kinds of subsistence practices. The work that women do is typically compatible with childcare, or at least more compatible with childcare than the work that men do. It produces low risk, and that's both low economic risk and physical risk. And usually the products that are produced by women are used to directly provision family members, or at least that's kind of the common conception about what happens with women's resources. Men's work, by contrast, or the work that most men tend to do, is usually not at all compatible with childcare, which is so nicely illustrated in this picture of the La Malera here at the bottom. Produces higher levels of risk, also nicely illustrated here. And it's sometimes used to directly provision family members, but as you know, we know there's a lot of argument about what the resources that men provide are actually used for. Whereas there's really not a lot of argument about women's resources and what they tend to be used for. So let me just make a quick note here. When I'm talking about risk, there are two types of risk that are usually referenced when we're thinking about sexual division of labor. One is physical risk, so how likely are you to be harmed or die while you're doing a particular task? And the other is economic risk. And so what I mean when I say risk in this talk is specifically economic risk. And I mean the variance in returns that are produced. So let me show you this figure here really quickly. This is reproduced from some data by Brian Cotting that he collected and published in 2011 with the birds, and then some ACA data, I believe. But basically, we've got the coefficient of variation, which is a commonly used measure of risk. It's the standard deviation divided by the mean. So as soon as you go over 1, above 1 in your coefficient of variation, then you're producing, there's more variance in what you're producing than sort of 0. On the bottom, on the x-axis here, we have the percent that women are contributing to a particular resource. And what you can see here is that the more women contribute to a particular resource in these societies, which are the Mardu, the Miriam, I think the ACA and the ACE, the lower risk it tends to produce economically, or the least amount of variance. So a lot of evolutionary theory has been focused so far on explaining the trends, because these trends are so pervasive across all types of human societies. Basically, there is a bit of argument in the literature. People disagree a bit on the proximate reasons for these trends, but they do tend to agree that the trends are based on biological sex differences, that the differences between men and women are shaped by the goals of their behavior, shaped by the biological differences, and they shape the goals of men's and women's subsistence behavior, as well as the efficiency of the behavior. And division of labor tends to support survival and well-being, particularly of children in evolutionary theory, but also of mothers and fathers, and it maximizes the reproductive success of both parents. But as we know, there is a lot of variation in how humans behave when it comes to childcare and work. Lee Gettler is going to be here next week. He's going to talk all about what dads do and how much dads parent. This is something that's been increasingly on the rise in the US and in other parts of the Western world. Men in a lot of societies do more parenting than we had previously thought. And there's also a lot of variation in the types of economic tasks that women often do, as well as things like how compatible they are with childcare. And in fact, there are a few really key examples where the work that women do also produce high amounts of risk. So there's a lot of variance associated with the resources that they're going after. This is a picture of a Haenyeo woman in South Korea. I don't know if any of you have read about the women's diving, but there's a lot of variance in how much women bring back, and it's also really, really physically risky. So there is quite a lot of variance in what women are doing. And what we don't know yet is why. What's causing this variance? So what are the socioecological predictors of women's work when it's not compatible with childcare and when it's producing higher risk, as well as the outcomes that come from this type of work? So the work that I'm doing now is focused on both aspects of understanding why women would do something that's unusual cross-culturally. The population that I work with, the Shodagor people of Bangladesh, are a subculture of semi-nomadic boat-dwelling people. They have been living on boats for many centuries. Well, according to their background, many centuries. And they're one of only a few cultures in the world of people who live on boats. But the number of people who are living on the boats is dwindling very quickly as people move onto the land and build makeshift homes for themselves. The Fieldsite that I work in is in Matlab, Bangladesh. So let me tell you really quickly about Matlab so that you don't think it's just full of only Shodagor people. There are around 200,000 people living in Matlab who are not Shodagor. So these are Bangladeshi people, majority Muslim, majority agricultural population. They live in extended family households on the land. And at any given time, there are around 150 Shodagor families, depending on the season. There are two sort of key features in Matlab that are really important to Shodagor families. One is the Meghna River here. This is one of the 3 largest rivers in Bangladesh, which is a country that is essentially one great big river delta. So this is a really, really huge river. And these green stars here represent Shodagor groups, little clusters of boats that exist within Matlab. And so people live on the Donagoda River here, and they live at varying distances from the confluence of the Donagoda with the Meghna. The other ecological feature that's important to Shodagor people are the major market towns. So there are 2 of those in Matlab. And I will talk to you a little bit more about why those are so important in just a second. Data for this talk was collected in 2014. We did a lot of quantitative surveying, asking about demographic data. We got a complete census of the Shodagor population in Matlab, although because they're semi-nomadic, that does change. And so we do our best to keep track of people coming and going. We also have detailed income data for almost all of the families in Matlab, and then anthropometric measures, spot sampling and focal follows, and a lot of open-ended interviewing as well. So this was a mixed methods approach to data collection, obviously, because what I really wanted to do was measure different aspects of parenting and economics and find out how they balance each other out. Data for the talk is also being collected now and is being collected in a continual data collection project that's been going since 2017, in which we're getting biweekly, year-round quantitative surveys on income and household expenditures, as well as major life history events in all of the households and illnesses of all household members, and then seasonal measures of anthropometrics, food security, and household wealth. I'm obviously not going to show you all of this data, but I want to give you a good idea about where it's coming from. Boat communities average between 5 and 20 families at any given time. During particular parts of the rainy season, some groups get bigger, some groups get smaller. People move based on occupational opportunities, so fishing primarily, and then they also just move seasonally to be closer to family. They average 2.5 moves per year. Some families don't move at all. They're living in sort of makeshift houses on the land, but that's, I think, about 1/3 of the population that I work with in Matlab. But the people who are living on boats when they move do it about 2.5 times per year. This is a relatively status and gender egalitarian group. Shodagor people say that they are traditionally status egalitarian, but as people have collected more wealth and are moving on to the land, that's changing a bit, and that if you have more wealth, you are considered to be higher status. There's also one leader per group, and that is typically inherited patrilineally, although inheritance is bilateral within the society, and they don't have a lot of property to inherit anyway. So identity is inherited through the father. Any kind of money or gold that the family might own is inherited through mother and father to both sexes. People live in nuclear family households, which is not super surprising given the size of these boats. There's not a lot of room for anything but the nuclear family in them. But they live in extended family groupings within the boat group. So they often have, it could be members of both the husband's and the wife's family in any particular group with them at one time or another. Monogamous marriage is also overwhelmingly the norm here. The important thing about the nuclear family household for Shodagor people is that there's very little sharing of money or food between families, or at least as reported to me. We're going to do a little bit more data collection on that in the years to come to understand maybe what is being shared. And then childcare is primarily focused within the nuclear family. So it's mostly mom or dad who's doing the majority of care of young kids all of the time. Grandparents certainly help, but they are not doing the majority of the care. Shodagor are heavily ingrained in the cash economy of Bangladesh. People who fish sell fish for cash, and then use the cash in the markets to buy different types of food. And then women who are trading are also trading directly for cash. But a lot of families, 85% of families also do subsistence fishing. So throughout the year, families are also eating quite a bit of what they catch. 95% of the men in the population in Matlab fish for a living for at least part of the year. The other 5% are doing things like wage labor or working in the markets. But what's really interesting from my perspective about Shodagor is that women have 3 different occupations that they can sort of choose from. And so what we have are that at any given time, about 20% are housewives, about 40% fish, almost always with their husbands, and then about 40% work as traders. And what the women who are trading do is that they leave their home, whether it's a boat or a house in the morning, they go to a major market town, which is why living near a major market is so important. They collect this large basket of household goods from a middleman who has a shop in town, and then they take the basket of goods and they go out on foot into the villages and sell the goods to non-Shodagor, to Bangladeshi women. And so this is a task that's quite different from these other 2. There are major differences between all 3 of these in terms of the economic risk that's produced. So let's go back to this figure here really quickly. Remember, on the y-axis, the higher you go, the more risk is produced. And on the x-axis is women's involvement in a particular economic task. If we map the Shodagor people onto this figure, this is fishing. It's men's and women's fishing. And this is the mean amount of variance that's produced. And then we have the standard deviation here. So it's very low risk. And this is trading. And so you have people who are essentially losing a lot of money sometimes when they go out trading. And they can do that either by not selling things for as much as they're worth, or if things got lost or stolen from them, et cetera, they're responsible for whatever goods they have. So trading is a very economically high-risk occupation. There are also major differences in compatibility with childcare. So you can see from these two pictures, women who are housewives are doing almost all of the childcare. It's very compatible with that. Women who are fishing almost always take their kids with them. They definitely take their infants. They can breastfeed their infants while they're rowing the boat, while they're helping their husbands pull up nets and things like that. And so it's highly compatible with infant care, and more compatible certainly with caring for slightly older children than is selling or trading, which is totally incompatible. Women report never ever taking infants or young children along with them when they're selling, usually because they start around 6 a.m. and they're out walking in the villages all day and don't get home until 7 p.m. or later. So they leave children at home. So the first question then is, what's predicting women's trading? What are the socioecological circumstances that allow women to do this cross-culturally unusual thing? To start with a little bit of theory, I'm going to refer to the economy of scale model here, and I'm going to spare you all of the deep theoretical details and just stick with the main assumptions. As I said before, there are sort of two main theories about the sexual division of labor that make for a good framework to make predictions from, and the economy of scale model is one that really focuses on the impacts of the nuclear family, and how the nuclear family affects the sexual division of labor. So that's the one that I'm going to focus on today. The main assumptions are risk is a byproduct of a comparative advantage or constraints of childcare. Usually, that's what the economy of scale model suggests. It also suggests that risk is complementary. So women are constrained by childcare. They have to do work that's compatible with childcare, and that also produces low variance. Men then, in turn, are free to produce or to engage in work that produces higher variance returns. That's the idea here. And then male and female activities are complementary too. So because women are doing the majority of the childcare, men are then free to go out and hunt or do these other things that they're doing. If we want to understand how this model would predict not just men doing these higher risk incompatible tasks, but how it would predict anyone doing that, what we would predict based on these assumptions is that there might be a comparative advantage for women in a high-risk activity, or for any individual in a high-risk activity. That could come from the ecology, from culture, or from any other number of places. We would have to remove constraints on women in order to sort of, meet these basic assumptions here. We could do that through having other people care for the kids or weaning early. You would also expect, based on the complementary nature of this, that husbands would opt for lower risk activities and that they would increase the amount of direct child care they're doing. Here's the data. I'm not going to force you to look at this. I'm going to walk you through these results here, but I want to show you very quickly just sort of what it looks like. We have run a Bayesian model, Bayesian regression here to predict different occupations, fishing, selling or trading, and then being a housewife. And here's what we see. These are our two ecological variables, and these are women who are trading. Living near a market town is a major predictor of women trading. So women who live near the market are much more likely to trade than women who don't. Then if we look at our alloparental and constraint removal variables here, what we can see is that removing the constraints of childcare really does have an impact. So women who are trading are more likely to have weaned children, and particularly children who are over the age of 3. There is also an increase in the amount of direct care that fathers are giving. So some fathers are staying home as primary caregiver of their children for up to 6 months a year. So they are doing all or the majority of childcare from 6 a.m. until dark, whenever their wives get home, which is cross-culturally very unusual. And then on top of fathers, let me show you this figure again. So we've got fathers in the model, and we have other alloparents as well. And even with fathers giving care, the additional alloparents are still predicting women's trading. So there's something about having a father as well as some other helpers and a weaned child. So to sum all of that up, if we think about the socioecological conditions that might be allowing women to do this cross-culturally unusual behavior, what we see are that biological differences are not necessarily relegating women to a particular economic task, that when they have an ecological advantage, like living closer to a major market, or a cultural advantage, which women do in this particular scenario, and I'm happy to talk more about later, that we might see them engaging in that task. And the complementarity between husband and wife probably is playing a role, at least in this scenario where the nuclear family is such an important institution. One thing that I do want to mention is what we did not find in the model was evidence that husbands are decreasing the amount of variance they're producing in their fishing when they have wives who are selling or trading. And one of the very likely reasons for that is that fishing is already a really low variance activity. So we've shown that women are doing this thing. We might have an understanding about why they're doing it. And the next question that would follow from that are what are some of the outcomes from that? Theory would suggest that trends in the gender division of labor are maximizing reproductive success of mothers and fathers, and that that's happening through the survival, good health, and well-being of their children. So if we think about trading and the fact that it is running counter to so many of the trends that are explained by the theory about sexual division of labor, then what we would predict based on that is that deviation from these trends, like we see with trading, should have negative consequences for measures of reproductive fitness. So you should see women whose children maybe don't have as high of survival rates, have ill health, or have growth and nutritional deficiencies. Something we know from the economic literature, though, is that there's been a lot of empirical work done on the effects of maternal autonomy on children's health and well-being. So cross-cultural measures of maternal autonomy often include working outside the home, the amount of income that women are making, so whether it's the raw amount of income they're making or the percentage of income within the household, as well as their own decision-making authority in the household. Higher maternal autonomy in the empirical literature often leads to positive outcomes for children. And so you see major organizations and countries making large sweeping policies about empowering women to be employed and earn their own money and things like that, because what's often associated with that is improved health for kids, improved nutrition, and other outcomes like having kids get more education and things like that. Women's trading is associated with more autonomy by these measures. So women who trade make a higher percentage of household income, have much more decision-making authority than women who do other occupations, and they work away from home for very long periods of time during the day. And so all of those things together lead me to conclude that women who are trading have more autonomy. What we would predict then is that the trading should actually have positive outcomes for kids. Maybe they'll have better growth in nutrition based on the global data that we've seen, better measures of health, and better measures of survival. So basically what I'm starting off with telling you is that I don't know what's going to happen and that we have reasons to believe that one or the other could be happening. So before delving into the details of some of the data, what I really wanted to do was to understand the factors that were contributing to differences in growth and nutritional outcome for all family members. So in this paper that was out in AJHB last year, my co-author and I looked at cross-sectional measures of height, weight, and BMI for all members of the family. Here is what the raw data looks like. So this is height for age. We've got males and females, and age is going along the x-axis there. And what you can see is that for males and females of all ages, people are basically following a normal growth curve. This is weight for age, which is a bit more scattered as we would predict. And this is BMI for age, so there's a lot more variation there. But I want to show you the raw data so that you know that it looks relatively normal. Plotted using WHO percentiles, which is, I agree, can be very problematic sometimes, but just to get sort of a sense of what's going on here with Shodagor children, what we can see is that when we look at height for age, a lot of the kids are falling within a normal range, but maybe about half of, at least half of the girls and some of the boys too are also shorter than what you would predict for their age. Many more children weigh less than sort of they should based on WHO standards for their age. So these children weigh a lot less than other kids of their own age in other parts of the world. But BMI is again kind of mixed. So you've got about half of the kids falling within the normal range and about half or a little more of the kids falling well below the normal range. So just so that you have an idea about what the population looks like on these measures. We ran mixed models so that we could get a holistic understanding, and we, within the mixed models, accounted for individual socioecological factors that we thought would be affecting these growth outcomes, as well as a random effect for shared household, and then we also modeled relatedness using an animal model. And what I do not want to focus on, which is of course why I'm telling you, basically this measure of relatedness here, this is cross-sectional data, and so we're not suggesting that genes are accounting for X amount of variance, but what we are suggesting is that in most populations, primarily Western populations, when you run a mixed model that's accounting for the relatedness within a household, how related people are and how much of an impact that relatedness is having on their height, weight, and BMI, you get a much higher estimate than this. And what that means is that genetics are accounting for more variation than an environment. So there's less variability in an environment. For the Shodagor, there's a lot of variability in the environment, which means that environmental variation is accounting for a lot of the variance that we see in people's body size. Socioecological variables are accounting for around 20%, and then a shared household is accounting for a little over 25% of the variation in BMI. So there's something going on in the household too. These are the variables that we primarily looked at here. These are the socioecological variables, and I'm not going to run through all of them, but I want to draw your attention to a few of the more important outcomes. So what we can see here, this is BMI, income, household annual income, or an estimate of household annual income, more accurately, has a positive impact on BMI for children. An interaction variable here between household income and a household's access to fish, which is measured by having at least one adult in the household that catches fish regularly, has a negative impact. And so what that's telling us here is that if you, regardless of your income, if you don't have someone in the household who's fishing, that you're going to have a lower BMI, or you're likely to have a lower BMI. So that access to fish really does seem to impact children's BMI. These ecological variables, the time to market and distance to magna, are again seem to be important for kids' BMI. The closer you live to one of them, you're slightly more likely to have a higher BMI. The previous variables that I showed you, income and fish access, and the ecological variables are all representative of your access to food. Any of these four things can indicate that you have more access to food than other people. It makes sense that all of those would have an impact on your BMI or your height or weight. When we look at variables that were measures of women's autonomy, we expected wife's income percentage and or wife's authority to have an impact on these outcomes, but they don't, or they may not. And in fact, mothers who earn a higher percentage of household income might have slightly lower BMIs. Wife's authority doesn't have any significant impact. So in not knowing exactly what that means, I've got some preliminary results to talk to you about here, because those variables, the percentage of income that women are earning in the household and their decision-making authority, are both proxies for their autonomy, which I already basically told you we would expect to be higher for women who are trading. And so if we take the raw data, these are some very preliminary results that I'm going to show you here. If we take the raw data and plot it, these are women who are not trading, or household members of women who are not trading, and household members of women who trade. And even though there's not, probably not a statistically significant difference here based on the data from 2014, you can see that a Z-scored BMI, all members of the household have slightly higher BMIs when the wife trades than when she doesn't. If we just look at the kids and we look at their height, weight, and BMI, again, the trend is there. They have slightly greater height, weight, and BMI if their mom trades than if she doesn't. We also wanted to look at some different measures of nutritional outcomes. We're looking at both food security measures as well as breastfeeding. These are the two measures that I currently have in my data of direct nutritional access for individuals. Okay, so we're looking at food security for the household from 2017, and again, it's broken up between women's occupation. Here they're not trading, here they are. There's no real difference between these two types of households in terms of how food secure they are. I should mention that was collected during the rainy season, which tends to be a more food secure season for Shodagor people. If we look at breastfeeding, these results are really interesting because we can see here that women who are not trading, there's a little bit more variability in how long they exclusively breastfeed their kids. This is not a quote-unquote statistically significant difference. But women who don't trade wean their kids at an average, or wean from exclusive breastfeeding, excuse me. So they introduce supplementary food at around 11 months. Women who are trading introduce supplementary food at around 8.5 months. So that's 2.5 months of difference. We don't know yet what kind of impact that's having on kids' overall health at that point. But women who are trading are weaning their kids on average 2.5 months earlier than women who aren't. So that's a possibly biologically significant difference. If we look at illnesses then, there's a statistically significant difference here. Households in which, these are the number of sick days for all children in the household. This does not control for the number of kids in the household, but I will tell you that there's not a major difference between in number of kids between women's excuse me, I'm going to get to that in just a second. So this is not controlling for the number of children in the household, but there's significantly more sick days in households where women trade for the kids than there are for women who are not trading. And again, that's a seasonal measure. right now. This is only accounting for the dry season, and I don't know what that would look like if we looked at both dry and rainy season. But trading does seem to be impacting kids' health. If we look at reproductive outcomes, we don't see a major difference or significant difference in mother's age at first birth. In both cases, women are having their first birth around 17. There is a difference in, there's also not a difference in the number of kids who live to age 3. There is a difference in the number of births. And so women who are not trading are on average having fewer births than women who are trading. But when you get to age 3, there's not a significant difference in the number of kids who are still alive. And so you can extrapolate from that and figure that more children are dying under the age of 3 when the wife trades. The interbirth interval here between first and second birth for women who trade is about 4 years, and women who don't trade is the average is 2.86 years. So there's a little more than a year of difference in the interval between first and second births. So to summarize all of the results that I just showed you, trading is positively associated with height and weight for kids, BMI for kids, moms, and dads. It's also associated with earlier weaning, more days of child illness, number of births, and longer birth intervals. So overall, trading is associated with positive growth outcomes for all family members. People seem to have bigger bodies in households where the woman trades. Obviously, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to sort of tease apart what sort of cause and effect there. Children's days of illness are negatively impacted by trading, or at least they appear to be quite negatively impacted. Children are having many more days of illness when their mom trades. And then mothers are making strategic decisions in order to spend more time working. Women report this qualitatively, but the quantitative data is also bearing that out, at least preliminarily. They're weaning at an earlier age, and they also have longer birth intervals. Women do have access to contraceptives in this population, but we also know that women have been, have many different types of contraceptives that they've used for, centuries before modern contraceptives were introduced, including these women's mothers who also report making strategic decisions about their reproduction. So to give you a very sort of crass conclusion here, theory would predict negative outcomes. Do we have negative outcomes from the preliminary data? Yes, we do. It does seem like there are some things that are worse off in the household when a mother is trading. But we also have positive outcomes that would be predicted based on the empirical evidence that's been shown cross-culturally. So, like I've said, these are really preliminary results. The outcomes are really preliminary results that we need to do a lot more work on to figure out what's actually going on in these households. But what they do so far is they highlight the trade-offs that women are making, as well as the strategic decisions about their reproductive lives when they have an occupation that's not compatible with childcare. The results show us that there are likely some negative health consequences for children, including earlier weaning, which is often related to negative outcomes later in life, greater risk of illness, and possibly increased mortality at earlier ages. But they also show some positive outcomes. There are some really interesting implications for divisions of household labor, including fathers providing a lot of direct care for children. And these findings are really informative so far for Shodagor women and for their families. But they're also really broadly applicable to women around the world. And so we go back to this slide, which shows that for the majority of countries around the world, women are increasing their participation in the labor force and increasingly doing work that's not compatible with simultaneous childcare. When women are making trade-offs, we are often ignoring the trade-offs when we're thinking about the outcomes for kids. And researchers often extrapolate from earlier economic studies and assume blanket positive outcomes of increased participation in the labor force for women, or increased amount of money, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to take into consideration the nuance that's probably going on in these households if we're actually going to address the things that lead to better outcomes for kids. We need to know what those things are. So there have been a few studies that have come out recently that are showing the type of job women have really does have an impact on how well their kids are doing. So if you're doing manual labor that takes you away from your kids all day long, your kids may not be doing as well as if you have a better job, for example. These findings, which are quite preliminary, are really adding some new evidence, and they're supporting some claims that people like Sarah Hrdy has been making for years that's contradicting the idea that women's involvement in work is always going to be a positive. I'm certainly not standing up here saying that women working more is a negative thing, but what I'm saying is that we need to understand the trade-offs they're making, and that trade-offs are probably not always associated with positive outcomes for women and their children. Women are making decisions about their reproduction in a strategic way. And this might be associated with other types of positive outcomes, like positive economic outcomes for a household. But it's also important to understand that strategic decisions and the trade-offs that women are making are not always going to have positive outcomes for health, survival, well-being of children and parents, so that we can, so that appropriate policy and interventions can be designed. So I want to thank the Shodagor people in Matlab, Bangladesh, who have been extremely generous with their time and energy and continue to be. All of my excellent field staff who are still out there working, collecting data every day, and then everybody who's worked with me on the data and different ideas and help formulate the thoughts on this. Thank you.
Maddie. Hi. So first off, I want to say thank you for presenting this, and I loved your pictures, especially. So maybe you collected data on this and just haven't analyzed it yet, so feel free to shut that down. But I recall you saying something about how the relationship between Shodagor and the ICDDRB is complicated by the fact that ICDDRB wants people to stay in one place for them to receive care, or it's something like that. It's not completely remembering, but I guess I'm asking if you could speak to the relationship between Shodagor women and the healthcare services that are available or not available to them.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So ICDDRB, the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research Bangladesh, is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that has a very large presence in Matlab in particular. They have an ongoing demographic surveillance project that's been going since the 60s, I believe. And people in, let's see if I've got a map here. No, that's Bangladesh. Anyway, people in Matlab, about half of Matlab on the southern side of the Donegal River are included in, quote unquote, the study area. And so all the people living in that part of Matlab are constantly surveilled demographically, but they also receive completely free health care for all kids under the age of 5, whether you were born in the area or move into the area, totally free prenatal and postnatal care, free childbirth in any of their sub-centers, and lots of other health benefits as well. And so, not surprisingly, the health outcomes for people in that part of Matlab are really positive. People in the other part of Matlab are mostly serviced by government healthcare systems. Shodagor people are living within the area that ICDDRB often services, or the majority of them are anyway. But because the women are often not home in order to complete, sort of like their check-in every month and say, yes, we still live here, this is the number of kids we have, et cetera, they are not included in the ICDDRB demographic surveillance. And so they don't have access to ICDDRB healthcare at all. They can access government healthcare, but it's not free. And it's a little bit more difficult to access because they don't live as close to the government subcenters. And so people are mostly waiting until they have a very catastrophic health situation for either themselves or their kids to take the family member to a hospital or a doctor or something like that. Otherwise, they're accessing a lot of traditional healers, and a lot of women give birth at home with a local Shodagor midwife. What I don't know actually about maternal and child health outcomes related to childbirth yet, but I do have the data to look at that. So basically, my takeaway point is I don't expect there to be a major difference among Shodagor based on access to ICDDRB because none of them have access to it. I have recently started to include some of the women who do have access in the project that I'm working on because a lot of those women who are who've been living on the land for a long time are trading. So I'll be able to answer your question better, but I mean, I expect there to be major drastic differences in health outcomes.
Yeah. Oh, and if I could just do a follow-up question. Another thing I'm curious about is what it means to be sort of, we've also talked a bit about their social, how they relate to the mainlanders.
Yeah.
And you might expect, I guess, in terms of cultural responses to new medical technologies, how they may or may not be, I guess just, it could be very interesting to think about how being in a social milieu that has a lot of discussions about medicine and medicine technologies are relatively higher might influence their decision making.
Yeah, so like access to contraception, for example, all women who are in the ICDRB, well, not ICDRB, all women in Matlab, because they're all being contacted frequently by ICDRB health workers, they all get free access to contraceptives. And contraceptive use is something that's been, a huge push in Bangladesh over the last few decades. Shodagor women can sometimes get free access to contraceptives, but mostly they're paying for them. I've got some data on how regularly they're using contraception and what kinds they're using. And my my takeaway is that they are attempting to use it regularly and properly, but that they may not always based on how well they can access it. So yes, I expect there to be very major differences. Shodagor people are also considered very low status compared to Bangladeshi families, non-Shodagor Bangladeshi families. So I think this area is rife for lots and lots of different types of research questions to be answered related to health outcomes, but I don't know a lot of the answers yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I have a question about men's work. So I'm thinking about the fact that the Shodagor are a minority in this area, right? And it seems like they've kind of carved out this little niche of being able to go in and do this trading.
Yeah.
But the thing that I kept coming back to in terms of thinking about this complementary division of labor is why was the women who entered this niche and started doing the selling and not the men? So you gave that slide where you showed the 20-40-40 breakdown of what women are doing. Can you just share a little bit more about what men are doing and if you have thoughts on why it was the women and not the men who decided to who were able to kind of capitalize on this niche?
Yes. So men are mostly fishing. 95% of the men in 2014 in the population that I was working with were catching fish for a living. There is some variability in how much they're doing it throughout the year. So like I said, some men stay home for half the year and take care of their kids, and then they fish for the other half of the year. But other than that, there's not a lot of variation in what men are doing for work, really. My understanding of why women are the ones who are filling this niche is that it was a niche that's available only to women. The majority Muslim population in Bangladesh they're still, or I shouldn't say still, but they're practicing they have a lot of very strict beliefs about purdah and contact of Muslim women with non-related men. And so you see a lot of, it's very uncommon, for example, for women to leave the house without a man accompanying them, etc. Shodagor women are going door to door, essentially, to the Muslim families' homes. And it would be really weird and not acceptable if it was an unknown or unrelated man entering these women's homes during the day when there aren't a lot of men around. And so some men do it, usually, almost always, they're doing it with their wives. And they'll go with their wives when they're pregnant or have, I think mostly when they're pregnant or sick or hurt or something, they carry the goods. But then the wife is the one who actually enters the home and interacts directly with the non-Shodagor women. So that's kind of the cultural niche that's there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if one possible variable that could influence individual differences among women, how they resolve this trade-off, would be personality traits. Because it seems to me that the trading would be helped by a quite different personality configuration than the fishing.
I would think so. So that's not something that I've ever asked about explicitly. I do know the women really well, and so there are a lot of women who are trading who have, pretty gregarious personalities. What I understand to be going on is that women seem to learn how to trade from a mother or from a female relative. So there are certainly women who just decide not to trade. They end up fishing with their husbands even though their mom or their aunt or somebody was trading. But it seems like an inherited thing that they learn from a female relative. But I would be interested to find out if women with different types of personalities are more or less successful at trading. I think that is probably where you would see a big difference coming in. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Did I read it right initially that the variance is higher on trading than the other options, but the expected value was much higher as well? Was I reading that?
No, sorry. So that was just the variance. There are women who are able to make a lot of money when they're trading. And so that's where the really high variance comes in. So you're almost as likely to lose a whole bunch of money as you are to make a bunch of money. There are men or people who fish who can actually make almost as much money as the women trading. So what I've found so far is there's not a huge difference in the expected maximum value. So you can make a lot of money doing either things, but when you're fishing, you are very likely to produce a relatively equal amount every time. It's usually not a lot, but you don't really lose money when you're fishing. And so you just see a lot less, how should I put this? You don't see as many high values, but you don't see almost any very low or zero values when you're fishing. So you just are always likely to bring something home.
Yeah, I was wondering about, in teasing apart causation, you said that there's like a high correlation between trading and living close to town.
Yeah.
Are you able to tease those apart? Because I can imagine living close to town also has other ways of influencing child health outcomes.
Definitely. Yeah. Yes, that was one of the things that we thought a lot about in I think it was a 2017 paper. Obviously living near markets has a big impact on health in lots of different ways. So as far as the health outcomes go, I don't know. One of the things that I will probably do is when I have a bigger sample size is look at the differences. So there are women living near town who don't sell or who don't trade. And we can compare those families to families where women do and hopefully get a better picture there. It's just one of the main problems is, aside from a really small sample size, there's one woman who does not live within 5 minutes of a major market who trades, and literally no other women do. They're also a very mobile population, or they're able to be very mobile, and so I've done a lot of talking to people about, can't you just move, closer to a market and trade? And their answer seems to be no. I don't want to do that. I don't have anyone to teach me to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know yet how to tease those things apart, but I take your point, and I think that's a really important distinction to make.
I was wondering, do you have any data on age differences in the type of work that women do? And so I was wondering specifically, do women do work outside the household before they get married, and what type of work do those women do when they don't have children yet, for example?
A lot of girls who end up trading, or women who end up trading, learn to do it in their natal household before they move, and so they do start to do it. I think probably around 14, 15 is the earliest age that moms or aunts or cousins start to take younger women along with them. And then the other women learn to fish when they're little kids. They go along with their parents when they're, from the time that they're born, essentially. And so, yes. So where there is an interesting difference is that some of the women who are in the sample here and are appearing as housewives, actually, once they've weaned their child, go back to trading. For the most part, I have asked women about what their primary occupation is, and so the numbers that I presented at the time were accurate. But for women who have had their first child, for example, they might end up deciding to trade later or fish later. So you can kind of go oscillate between housewife and another occupation, and that does change over time. But your primary occupation, once you've kind of decided on what it is, which most people do before they get married, doesn't seem to change very much.
Great talk, Katie. I was wondering, to extend your depiction of what's happening here in terms of this interesting reversal of the economic patterns here, which is so cool. Is there anything that you can say qualitatively or quantitatively about some of the risks that women who are traveling far away from home on a daily business into areas, exploring new customer bases and doing this kind of shoe leather salespersonship?
Yeah.
What kind of safety is unfortunately very often a constraint on women's travel, more so than on men's. So
Yeah.
Is there anything in there about counter strategies or other ways that they go about their work to sort of deal with this unfortunate usual factor in ecology structuring women's work?
Yes, yes, there definitely is. Women usually travel in a group to the sort of village where they're all going to go sell, and then they disperse and come back together. There's actually a lot of physical risk involved in trading, not because the activity of trading is necessarily physically risky, but road accidents are really common in Bangladesh, and so a lot of women travel in groups in order to protect, their safety in terms of, from sexual abuse or harassment or things like that. They travel in groups, and they will travel, they'll pack themselves into a very small three-wheeled vehicle, a tuk-tuk in Africa, or a CNG is what they call it in Bangladesh. And so I have known many women who've been in accidents, and they're, injured for many, many years and unable to ever trade again. So there is physical risk involved. I know about it qualitatively and not quantitatively. Reputational risk is also a big deal, which is partially why Shodagor is seen as such low status, because women are not thought of in high regard because they, travel without husbands or related men. But group travel is the main strategy that women are undertaking to try to prevent against this. And so I'm actually working on looking at social networks of female traders with a co-author of mine, and we're finding that, surprise, surprise, women who trade have much more extensive social networks with other women who trade than women who do other occupations.
More on that, do the groups of women that trade together, do they compete with each other for access to better trading venues? And do they pool risk? Given all the risk and outcomes, do they pool that in any way?
They do not to my knowledge anyway. So I don't know about the competition thing. I'm really interested in it. No one has ever said anything to me about that. I have asked, how do you decide where you're going to go for the day? And I've asked this about fishing too, to try to get a sense for whether there's sort of like territory that people have claim over, and they just kind of say whoever gets there first. It's they get to work the area or whatever. But as far as I know, there is no pooling of resources like at the end of the day. So whatever each individual woman earns, she keeps it, and she doesn't share any of it with the women she worked with. Where they do sort of, I guess, pool their resources, if they take a vehicle out to like a farther destination, they pay for it together and stuff like that. Otherwise, no.
So just thinking about extrapolating out, but maybe not out quite as far as the kind of global women's work in the paid labor force. So I think there are some interesting predictions here about whether you could use the variation how variable men's productivity is, and then if it in the less variable it is, the more likely that women can take up these kind of niches. I mean, this seems like all the right kind of pieces to the pie were in the right place, and I think it's a really interesting sort of ethnographic story about how this came to be. And I'm just wondering if you've looked at all or thought about whether you think you could make cross-cultural comparisons that look at something about the variation in men's subsistence activities. And have you heard of other pieces like this?
I've heard of, that's a really good question, and I don't know. So I don't know about when men do sort of low variance activities, whether that sets women up to be able to do something like this. I know of a few other examples from around the world where women are doing something that kind of looks similar to this. So I know Zapotec women in Mexico, when they are doing a lot of market trading, apparently is quite similar to this, and men stay home and take care of the kids. There's one account in one book about women who are traders in the Philippines who do something like this too. It sounds actually very, very similar, and also the men stay home with the kids, and then the Haenyeo women in South Korea, same kind of thing. That one's much more explicitly risky.
This is the diving women?
Yes, but in all of those cases, I don't yet know what the men are doing necessarily, except that they stay home with the kids. And so I don't know if they're producing anything economically, and that would be a really interesting question.
Yeah, especially if fishing, I mean, I don't know how this works, but maybe Brian knows better than I do, like whether fishing in general, like, so you imagine like big fishing, like the Mamalera, right, is going to be extremely variable. But smaller scale fishing is usually less variable. Is that right?
Less variable than large-scale fishing, or?
No, definitely, but then hunting, then other kinds of hunting. Like, is marine foraging somehow, I don't know, small, like fishing like that?
I think, it is, and on the comparison that Cotting published, the fishing is probably primarily female in the Aka. So, guessing how those trends lie, I would say that would probably be the outcome for fishing versus for hunting.
Yeah, my understanding is that
Smaller stuff.
small scale fishing like in rivers and lakes and stuff like that is pretty low variance. Once you get out into the oceans, it's much higher variance. And also depending on how big the fish are that you're going after. These guys are going after relatively like small and medium sized fish, and they're
Right, because
a lot of
it's
them.
only river, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
they're only fishing in the river.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that 95% of the men are fishing here is really interesting. I mean, I guess they could be doing some sort of agriculture or something. That if they,
Yeah,
that's
they-
the neighboring offenders or
They could do that, and some of them get hired during the dry season to do some wage labor and things like that. It's just usually pretty short term, and they don't sort of claim that as their primary occupation. Fishing and trading are traditional Shodagor occupations, and so people, their origin story comes from the prophet Noah in the Bible. So their origin story says that they've been fishing since the time Shodagor came about, and then women say that they've been trading for decades at least.
The decisions that the women make, how much influence do the husbands and our man family have on the decision process?
Oh, on which occupations they're, yeah. Usually, so sort of what Renee was getting to earlier, there's usually an understanding when they get married that women who are going to trade have some background in it and that they could keep doing that. So marriages are primarily arranged. So parents will arrange a marriage with, the idea that their daughter is going to continue trading after she gets married. So in those cases, there's very little negotiation between spouses. Where I imagine the negotiation comes in is whether the husband's going to stay home and take care of the kids. So I have a lot of data actually on what their parents have done, on what couples' parents have done in terms of did the dad stay home and take care of the kids, and what was their mother's primary occupation. My guess would be that there's some matching between couples on those types of things, but I don't know that for sure yet. I think usually where the negotiation comes in for the much younger women now is it's becoming a lot more common for women's parents to arrange a marriage with the explicit expectation that their daughter will not have to work after she gets married. And so primarily because that's considered so low status. And you can presumably marry your daughter to a higher wealth man or when he has more wealth, then she doesn't have to work. That doesn't usually hold up, and most women end up working anyway because they want to, usually. And so I think the negotiation there is usually with the mother-in-law, but somewhat with the husband. But women have a lot of decision-making authority generally in the group, and so I've only had a couple cases where women have said that their husbands, have made the decision for them, essentially.
Hi, so I know that this part of the world, and actually many parts of the world, are undergoing very significant climate change. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how you've thought about, some of the things that are shifting for them, and how you may or may not incorporate that into the work you're doing to try to tease apart these causal relationships.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a really good answer to that or not. But yeah, I mean, climate change, Bangladesh is one of the countries that's being most affected by climate change now. There are a lot of areas in Matlab that used to be land and are now underwater because of river erosion. Shodagor are primarily impacted by that in two ways. One is that it is an explicit goal of many families to save enough money to buy a little bit of land and build a house, or kind of a makeshift house on that land. As land erodes, many, or at least some Shodagor families who previously were able to buy land and live on the land have gone back into the boats because they lost their land. And Bangladesh is a heavily populated country where there's not a lot of land to spare anyway. And so that's one way that it has affected people in the recent past, and I expect it to continue to affect people because there are some homes that are very precariously perched. And with the flooding, there's been some severe flooding in the country over the last few years, and it's making it more and more difficult for people to live on the land during the rainy season. The other way that it directly impacts families now is that the salination of the water is changed dramatically when there's more flooding. And so the types of fish and their ability to catch the fish based on volume of water as well is really changing. And so you might expect off the cuff that when there's flooding, fishing would be easier because fish would, flow to more places. But it's actually the opposite, because the types of fish they're used to catching in particular areas aren't there anymore, or there's not as great of a volume of those types of fish. So they're being impacted in those ways now. It seems like they have this cultural sort of pre-adaptation to climate change in a way, in that they live on boats already. But I don't know how that's going to affect people necessarily. And my plan is, as I'm collecting longitudinal data over the next couple of decades, that I'll have be able to sort of see the change in real time and understand at that point how it's affecting people.
Yeah, slightly more abstract, difficult question, but you at the beginning alluded to sex differences and the literature on sex differences, and I'm curious, what do you see in your work any implication for the debate on sex differences, and what might it be?
So I think the main way that I'm thinking about sex differences in relationship to this particular question is that it's usually used as the premise for the evolution of the sexual division of labor. The biological differences between men and women put these particular constraints of pregnancy and lactation on women, and therefore they are forever sort of constrained in the occupations or the economic tasks they're able to engage in. I think the main way that this work challenges that notion is that women are strategically removing these constraints. They are weaning early. They're using modern forms of contraception, but their mothers were doing it as well, and their mothers' mothers. And so they're not as constrained by their biology as I think the literature on sex differences would suggest. And I think that's a really important challenge that this can bring to bear on the argument.
I just want to follow up on this because I think, so it seems like the fact that humans are cooperative breeders is a big part of that, and that is an avenue, right? So if you look at women in, like us, right, who somebody else is watching our kids, and right, and so we're able to work around these constraints of pregnancy and lactation to some extent, at least because of that kind of paid force. But the idea that this potentially could have gone way, way back in time if you have a cooperative breeding structure, so that, and yet at the same time, we don't. This still seems to be pretty unusual, right? I mean, so. I think it does raise some interesting questions about sorry, this is a comment on the question, sorry. I'm just trying to piece it together, because I think it's so fascinating, and then trying to think about why cooperative breeding in a way isn't doing a better job of allowing women to break free of some of these constraints.
Well, so I think that one of the challenges we have, honestly, is that there is not enough empirical data on what women are doing, where their kids are at the time, who's caring for the kids, et cetera, how much time they're spending away from home, and things like that. And so my guess, actually, would be that there's much more variability than we currently account for in the literature. In that I think a lot of the variability has been assumed from qualitative accounts, and that throughout the lifespan, even foraging can be more or less compatible with childcare, right? And so I think, I'm thinking of accounts from Kung people, for example, where women take infants along with them, but they often leave slightly older kids at home to be cared for by much older kids or other women. And then they're able to be gone for longer periods of time. Courtney Meehan had that great paper several years ago about how cooperative breeding was allowing women to return to work and stay at work work for longer periods of time, stay at work, sorry, but be out working essentially and away from their kids for longer periods of time. And I think, so I don't know exactly, and I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that we actually need more empirical data on to know how much time women are spending away from their kids and how compatible their work actually is with childcare. Because when you think about foraging, I think that is quite compatible with infant care in particular. But I think it's more or less so with different subsistence systems and stuff. It's just more compatible than men's work. I mean, that's kind of the blanket statement that's often applied in the sexual division of labor literature.
But it could be you're hitting on something with the fact that the workaround you can't really fix is that infant period. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So if you don't have access to formula, then you're
Right.
constrained in at least at certain points of after each, let's say late pregnancy, in the first few months, whatever it is, 6 months, let's say after birth before you can introduce. And that may, whether, it would be interesting from the modeling perspective just to know if you're gonna do that X number of times over the course of your reproductive career, if that's enough to constrain you from switching to a generally high-risk strategy, which you would have to opt out of X number of times often.
So I have this little pet theory in the back of my mind, which could be completely wrong, but that because this is something, modeling-wise at least, that Hilly Kaplan and Mike Gervin and others have dealt with a bit. But I think there might be something going on with the type of task it is and how hindered you are from taking a certain amount of time away from the task. And I think that might be something that's driving whether women can engage in these economically risky activities or not. So for example, for hunting, if it's a task that you have to practice over and over again and continually do in order to stay good enough at it, then taking, 5 or 6 months off 7 times in your lifetime when you're at your strongest might be a really big deal. But if it's something more like trading, where it might be more about personality or your ability to connect with people or something like that, or have clients that you return to over and over, then you're not as constrained by taking a little bit of time off. So I don't know, but that's something I'm thinking about.
Maybe one more.
Anyone else?
Yes, Maddie.
Hi. I'm interested if you're collecting data about the types of diseases and the types of sick days, basically, that these children are undergoing. 'Cause you might imagine, the kids are going to get sick at a certain point, but the types of decisions you make might influence what type of sick they get, how long they're sick, how debilitated they are for any given sick day. So what do you think about that?
Yes, so there's a lot of good data out there, or a lot of good papers out there showing that some of the ways that a woman's income or her, more education and things like that, women's autonomy influences child illness, is that, of course, there are preventative steps you can take and that you're more likely to know about and be able to access based on your background. But another big issue is how quickly you can get a child to the doctor once they get sick and how much that impacts how long they're sick for and how serious the illness becomes. Yes, I have data on all of that stuff, including whether they took somebody to the doctor or not, although not how soon they took them to the doctor. But so I don't know exactly yet how that is applying in this situation, but I certainly expect it to. If you have higher household income, you can access a doctor that requires you to pay money for them. And so I do think that's probably going on here, but I don't know for sure.
But you're on it.
We'll see.
Okay, I'll come back.
So I should have said that the illness data, it's right now I'm just using number of days that a person in the household has been sick, and that same trend is there whether you only look at children or whether you look at adults too. Everyone in the household is having more sick days, or a higher number of days they spend sick, and that is probably also related to the fact that these women are interacting with more people and they're in the markets and going door to door and things like that. So they're exposed to more viruses and bacteria. But the data also includes what they were sick with, whether they went to a doctor or not, and how much money they spent at the doctor. So one of the wonderful and terrifying things about the postdoc at the Max Planck Institute is that Richard McElrath, you know, sends you to the field, you come home with tons and tons and tons of data, and you know, you spend years analyzing it. So I'm on year 1 of analyzing. So
Very excited to see what happens.
Great, thanks.